moon hung low in the midnight sky, casting an eerie glow over the cobbled streets of the ancient town. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, a chill biting through the stillness. No one dared venture out this late. The stories were enough to keep them inside. Lurking in the shadows, he waited, a figure as old as time itself, his eyes cold with centuries of rage. The vampire, who once roamed freely in the world of the living, now moved like a ghost, silent, deadly, and invisible to those who dared not look too closely. His name? Elias. He had been born in an era where kings ruled with an iron fist and the world was full of secrets whispered behind closed doors. A time when power was earned through bloodshed and betrayal. A time when Elias was still human, naive to the true nature of the world. But that was before everything changed. Before they killed him. The ones he trusted, the ones he loved, had torn him apart, leaving him to die in the dark. His life snuffed out like a candle in a storm. But death had not claimed him. Instead, it had transformed him. The curse of immortality, the thirst for blood. For centuries, Elias hunted, his vengeance a slow, insidious poison coursing through his veins. One by one, those responsible for his torment had fallen, each death a painful reminder of what he had lost. But the final piece of the puzzle was still missing. One last name, one last person to make pay. Tonight, that name would be spoken. He could feel it in the air, the tension thickening around him. He was close now, so close. The person who had turned his life into a nightmare was within reach. The time for revenge had come. But something was different this time. As he slipped silently through the narrow alleyways, a strange warmth spread through his chest. A feeling he hadn't allowed himself to experience in over a century. Something he had forgotten even existed. Love. The human world had a way of tugging at the heartstrings, even for one as ancient and ruthless as Elias. It had taken him by surprise, this feeling, this fragile, delicate thing that had begun to take root in his cold, dead heart. He had met her by accident, a mere mortal caught in the crossfire of his plans. Her name was Lydia, innocent, full of life, and yet there she was, standing between him and his mission. He had thought he could resist. He thought he could walk away, but he hadn't. And now, as the final name hovered in the back of his mind, a part of him began to question everything. Would he go through with it? The vengeance that had consumed him for centuries? Or would the love he had found in her eyes be enough to change the course of his fate? As the door to the mansion creaked open before him, Elias knew the answer. The end was near, but so was the beginning of something far more dangerous. The night would reveal whether love could truly heal the wounds of a tortured soul, or whether hatred would finally consume him entirely. The mansion loomed in front of him, its towering gates like the mouth of a beast waiting to devour anyone foolish enough to enter. The stone walls were weathered by time, yet they held secrets within them. Secrets Elias was ready to uncover. His steps were quiet, methodical. His sharp senses detected every movement, every whisper of air. He was so close now, closer than he had ever been. The taste of vengeance lingered on his tongue, bitter and sharp like the blood he once drank without a second thought. But tonight, things felt different. Inside the mansion, the final name sat in the comfort of a false security. The one who had betrayed him, Lucius, the man who had condemned him to a life of eternal darkness. It was Lucius who had turned him, sealed his fate with a single bite. A gift, as Lucius had called it. A gift Elias had never asked for. He had hunted down every trace of Lucius's existence, each clue leading him closer to this moment. And yet, now that he stood at the threshold of Lucius's final resting place, Elias felt a hesitation he couldn't shake. A memory resurfaced, one from his time as a human, long before the thirst for blood consumed him. He had been in love once. Her name was Evelyn, a beautiful woman with a heart as kind as the sun is warm. She had been everything to him, his world. And then, in the blink of an eye, she had been taken away. The disease, the plague that had swept through their village had stolen her from him. Elias had never forgiven himself for not being able to save her. Perhaps it was that same feeling, this overwhelming sense of love, that now clawed at his heart. But this time, it wasn't a woman he had lost. This time, it was his own humanity. The door creaked as he stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and dust, but beneath it, he could smell something far more dangerous. Lucius's presence. He was here, somewhere, waiting, watching. Elias's eyes glowed faintly in the dim light. His teeth elongated slightly, the sharpness a reminder of what he had become. He could feel the power of his transformation coursing through him, the bloodlust urging him forward. But still, he hesitated. The image of Lydia flashed in his mind. Her smile, her warmth, the way her touch had softened the edges of his broken soul. What would she think of him now? Would she ever forgive him for the blood he had spilled, for the pain he had caused? And yet, he couldn't ignore the burning rage that had festered inside him for centuries. The need for closure, the need to see Lucius's blood spill, the need for retribution. Elias tightened his fists, stepping deeper into the mansion. He could hear footsteps echoing from the hallway, a slow, deliberate pace. His heart, if it could still beat, would be pounding. Lucius was close, but before he could move, a soft sound reached his ears. It wasn't the creak of the floorboards beneath Lucius's feet. No, this was something different. A voice, a quiet whisper. Elias. The name was spoken with such tenderness, such familiarity, that Elias froze. His heart clenched, and his body stiffened in response. Lydia. He hadn't expected her to be here. Not in this place, not now. What was she doing in the mansion? How had she found him? The answers eluded him, but the confusion inside him was all too real. Turning around, he saw her standing at the far end of the hallway, her pale face illuminated by the soft glow of a distant candle. Her eyes met his, and for a moment, the weight of the world seemed to lift from his shoulders. But only for a moment. Lydia, he whispered, his voice hoarse, torn between desire and guilt. What are you doing here? She stepped forward cautiously, her gaze never leaving his. I couldn't stay away, she said, her voice trembling. I had to see you. I couldn't let you go through with this. Whatever it is you're planning. Elias's heart pounded in his chest, an almost impossible sensation for one who had long ago lost the ability to feel. His fangs began to retract slightly, but his thirst for revenge still burned inside him. I don't want you involved in this, Elias said, his voice low and filled with urgency. This isn't your fight. Lydia shook her head, her expression full of determination. You're wrong. It's my fight too. You've changed me, Elias. I can't just watch you destroy yourself. I won't. He took a step toward her, his mind racing. He wanted to reach out to her, to tell her everything, but the words wouldn't come. The truth was too painful, and the danger too great. The man who had turned him, Lucius, was still waiting, and if Elias didn't finish what he had started, his torment would never end. But Lydia was different. She made him feel human again, and that was something he could not afford to lose. Not now. Elias stood motionless, the weight of Lydia's words hanging in the air like a thick fog. Her presence, so warm and real, clashed violently with the cold, calculated purpose that had driven him for so long. In the quiet of the mansion, the only sound was the distant thrum of his own heartbeat, a heartbeat he had long since believed to be extinct. You don't understand, Elias said, his voice now softer, more desperate. Lucius doesn't just deserve to die. He deserves to suffer like I did. He took everything from me, everything that ever mattered. You can't stop me from making him pay. Lydia's eyes softened with sorrow, but her resolve remained unshaken. I understand more than you think, she said, stepping closer, her footsteps quiet on the old wooden floor. But revenge won't heal your wounds. won't, Elias. It won't bring back what you lost. It will only make you just like him, empty. And that's not who you are. For a long moment, Elias just stared at her, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. He had never allowed himself to feel like this, never allowed anyone to come this close. And yet here she was, standing before him, offering something he had long since abandoned: hope. The air in the mansion grew heavier, charged with the intensity of their silent exchange. Elias could feel the darkness creeping in, urging him to act, to finish what he had started. The clock was ticking, but Lydia, with her unwavering gaze, was an anchor he hadn't known he needed. "I'm not a man anymore," Elias muttered, looking away. "I'm a monster, and monsters don't deserve love." Lydia reached out, her hand trembling ever so slightly as she touched his arm. "That's not true," she whispered. "You're still Elias. You're still the man who saved me, the man who showed me kindness when no one else would. You're not a monster." Her touch burned him, and not in the way that hunger for blood did. This was something else, something far deeper. He could feel her pulse, steady and strong beneath her skin. The scent of her blood, so intoxicating, threatened to overwhelm him. It was a battle between his thirst for vengeance and the tenderness that threatened to break him apart. He pulled away from her gently, a pained expression crossing his face. "You don't know what I've become, Lydia. I've walked through the darkness for centuries. I've killed without remorse. You can't save me. No one can." Lydia didn't flinch. She stepped closer, her voice calm but firm. "I don't want to save you, Elias. I just want you to understand that you're not alone. I'm here. I always will be." But the sound of footsteps cut through the silence, sharp and deliberate. The time for words had passed. Lucius was coming. Elias's gaze hardened, his fangs now visible as his transformation took over. "It's too late," he said, his voice cold. "Lucius has to die. And if I have to become the monster to make that happen, then so be it." Lydia's heart raced in fear, but she didn't back away. "Please," she whispered, desperation in her voice. "Don't do this." But it was too late. The door to the inner chamber opened with a creak, and there he stood, Lucius. His tall figure cast a long shadow across the room, his eyes glinting with the same cold, calculating look Elias had come to expect after all these years. Lucius smiled, a twisted grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Elias," he said, his voice smooth, almost mocking. "I wondered when you would show up. I've been expecting you." Elias's body tensed, his claws now fully extended, his fangs aching for the blood that would soon be spilled. Every fiber of his being screamed for vengeance. Lucius stepped into the room, his presence suffocating. "You're still angry, I see. After all these years, still chasing shadows. But tell me, Elias, what has it really cost you? You've become just like me. A predator. A killer." Elias's lips curled in a snarl. "I'll never be like you, Lucius. I was a man before you turned me into this thing. And now I'll destroy everything you ever cared about." Lucius laughed softly, stepping closer. "I have no care for anything but power. And you're nothing but a broken tool, a slave to your own bitterness. Tell me, Elias, how does it feel to finally face the consequences of your own choices?" Elias's mind swirled with fury and his vision blurred with rage. He could feel the pull of his old self, the part of him that had been human, that still clung to some semblance of the life he had once known. But it was fading fast, drowned by the desire for revenge. Lydia stepped forward, her eyes locked on Elias. "Elias, listen to me," she cried, her voice full of emotion. "This isn't who you are. You're not a monster. You're the man who cared about me. Please, don't lose yourself to this." Elias's eyes flickered between Lucius and Lydia, the two forces pulling him in opposite directions. His heart, if it could still be called that, pounded in his chest. Lucius saw his hesitation, and with a smirk, he took a step toward Lydia. "You think you can save him?" "How quaint," Lucius sneered. "But there's nothing left of Elias. Only the beast you see before you now." With a growl, Elias lunged at Lucius, the rage inside him erupting like a volcano. But just as quickly, he stopped, frozen by Lydia's voice. "Don't," she shouted, grabbing his arm. "Elias, please." For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The chaos, the pain, the hunger, it all came crashing down on him, and in the silence, Elias faced a choice. Would he allow his love for Lydia to pull him from the abyss, or would the thirst for vengeance finally consume him? Elias's heart raced as the seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity. His gaze flickered from Lucius to Lydia, torn between the man who had shaped his torment for centuries and the woman who had reignited something he had long thought dead inside him. Lucius's mocking laughter echoed in his ears. "You're weak, Elias. Look at you. back into your pathetic humanity. It's over. You will never be the man you once were. You're nothing but a shadow now, a tool for my amusement. The words cut deeper than any blade. They reminded him of all the pain he had suffered, all the blood he had shed, all the years of darkness that had been his only companions. Lucius was right about one thing. He was no longer the man he had been. But was he truly the monster Lucius claimed? Or was there still a shred of Elias left inside? Lydia's voice pierced the chaos, her soft hand on his arm grounding him. Elias, I know what he did to you, but you don't have to become him. You have the power to choose. Her words resonated within him, reverberating through the hollow spaces of his soul. For the first time in centuries, Elias felt something other than anger and pain. He felt doubt, a crack in the armor of vengeance that had shielded him for so long. Lucius stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. Pathetic, he spat. You think you can save him, Lydia? You're only prolonging the inevitable. He will never escape me. Elias's body shook, the conflict inside him threatening to tear him apart. He could feel the weight of the past bearing down on him, the years of bloodshed and rage rushing back with full force. His fangs ached for Lucius's blood. The darkness was so close, so easy to fall into. But Lydia's words were like a lifeline. She was here, holding on to him, even as the storm raged around them. She believed in him. And perhaps, just perhaps, that was all he needed to find the strength to break free. With a growl, Elias pushed forward, his body shaking with the struggle to control the beast within. Lucius sneered, his eyes glinting with malice as he raised his hand to strike. But just as the first movement of the battle began, Elias froze. Lydia stepped in front of him, her arms outstretched. No, Elias. You're not this, she said, her voice calm but firm. Please. For me. For us. The moment she spoke those words, Elias felt something shift inside him. He wasn't sure what it was, whether it was love, regret, or something far deeper. But in that instant, he realized he couldn't allow his hatred to consume him. Not now. Not when he had something to live for. Lucius's grin faltered as he saw the hesitation in Elias's eyes. What's this? Are you actually thinking of sparing me? He mocked. You're pathetic. You've forgotten who you are. I made you. Elias turned his gaze toward Lydia, his eyes filled with an emotion he hadn't felt in centuries. Guilt. I'm sorry, he whispered. I'm sorry for all the pain I've caused. Lydia's eyes softened, her voice full of tenderness. You've done things you regret, but that doesn't define you, Elias. It's the choices you make now that matter. For a moment, Elias simply stood there, staring into her eyes. The choice was his. The vengeance that had ruled his existence, the anger that had consumed him for so long, it was all within his grasp. But now Lydia's love, her unwavering belief in him, gave him the strength to push it all aside. He turned to Lucius, his gaze cold and resolved. You don't deserve to die at my hands, Elias said, his voice steady. Not anymore. The vengeance I sought ends here. Lucius's face twisted in fury. You fool, he roared, lunging at Elias. But before he could reach him, Elias moved with lightning speed, his fangs bared. He grabbed Lucius by the throat, his grip unyielding, but instead of crushing his life out, Elias simply held him there, suspended, caught in the grip of his choice. You are no longer my master, Elias said, his voice low and filled with finality. And I will never be your weapon again. With that, he let go of Lucius, allowing the vampire to fall to the floor, gasping for air. Lucius scrambled backward, fear flashing in his eyes. Elias didn't move. He didn't need to. Lucius, now realizing the shift in power, hissed, You've made a mistake, Elias. You'll regret this. I'll never let you go. You belong to me. Elias didn't reply. He turned toward Lydia, who stood there, watching him with an expression of disbelief and relief. She had believed in him, and for the first time, he believed in himself too. Elias, she whispered, taking a step toward him. You did it. You're free. Elias looked down at her, his eyes softening. No, he said quietly. I'm not free yet, but I'll find a way to be. The mansion seemed quieter now, as though the very walls had exhaled a long-held breath. Elias stood in the midst of the wreckage. Lucius sprawled on the floor, still gasping for air. His eyes burned with hatred, but it was clear that his power had waned in the face of Elias's unexpected decision. Lydia was still beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. There was a silent understanding between them now, a bond forged in the tension of the moment. Elias knew it wasn't over. Not yet. Lucius would be a thorn in his side for as long as he lived. But for now, the immediate threat had been neutralized. Lucius pushed himself up from the floor, his movements shaky but dangerous. "You'll regret this, Elias," he spat, blood dripping from his mouth. "You think you've beaten me, but this is just the beginning. The world doesn't forgive monsters, and neither do I." Elias didn't flinch. His expression was a mixture of resolve and quiet sadness. "It's over, Lucius," he said. "Your game ends here." Lucius's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Elias saw a flicker of something else, a reflection of the fear that had begun to overtake him. Lucius's carefully constructed facade of invincibility was crumbling. It was the first time Elias had seen him vulnerable, and the sight was almost satisfying. But there was no joy in it, no victory to claim, just a deep, aching emptiness inside that had always been there, hidden beneath the layers of vengeance and rage. Lydia's voice broke through the silence. "We should go," she urged gently, her eyes darting nervously toward the exit. "Lucius won't give up that easily. We need to be ready for whatever comes next." Elias nodded, his gaze still fixed on Lucius. The former master of his torment didn't move, but Elias knew that Lucius was more dangerous now than ever before. The vampire's pride had been wounded, and there was no telling how far he would go to reclaim his power. Without another word, Elias turned, his hands still resting protectively on Lydia's arm. She gave him a quick, reassuring glance before following him toward the exit. But as they reached the doorway, a voice, low guttural, stopped them. "Don't think this is over, Elias," Lucius growled from behind them. "I'll find you, and when I do, I'll show you what real pain is." Elias didn't look back. He knew better than to waste his energy on threats. He had already made his decision. He had chosen a new path, one that didn't rely on vengeance, on rage. But that didn't mean Lucius wouldn't try to pull him back into the darkness. As Elias stepped out into the cold night, the weight of his decision settled heavily on his shoulders. The stars above seemed so distant, so unreachable. They didn't offer him comfort, only the reminder that he was now walking in the shadow of a new, uncertain future. Lydia's soft voice broke the silence once more. "You did the right thing," she said, her words simple but filled with meaning. "You chose who you want to be." Elias didn't answer right away. His thoughts were a swirl of emotions: relief, fear, guilt, and something else. Something he had buried deep within himself for so long. "I'm not sure what I am anymore," he muttered. "I'm not the same man who walked into that mansion tonight. I don't know how to be the man you believe I am." Lydia stopped walking, turning to face him. Her eyes were steady, filled with an understanding he hadn't expected. "You don't have to have all the answers, Elias. All I know is that you're trying, and that's enough for me." Elias met her gaze, the quiet power of her words settling into his soul. She had every reason to hate him, to fear him, and yet here she was standing beside him, believing in him. For the first time in what felt like forever, Elias allowed himself to believe in something too. Not in vengeance, not in the cold, relentless pursuit of retribution, but in something much more fragile, something called redemption. His heart, once a thing of stone, began to soften just a little more. But even as the promise of a new beginning began to take root inside him, he knew there would be no easy path forward. Lucius was still out there, and the shadows that had once defined Elias's existence would continue to lurk at the edges of his soul. He wasn't free yet, but for the first time in centuries, he had hope, and that was a weapon he had never known he needed. The night air was crisp, a biting reminder of the world that existed beyond the walls of the mansion. As Elias and Lydia walked through the streets, the sounds of the town, quiet, peaceful, seemed almost foreign to him now. His senses, once sharpened for hunting, now took in every detail with a new perspective. The rustle of leaves in the wind, an owl, the faint flicker of candlelight in the windows. It was all so human, so alive. Elias's steps were heavy, though burdened by the weight of what he had just done, what he had chosen. He had walked away from vengeance, from the darkness that had defined him for centuries. But as the fog of his decision began to lift, he felt the sting of uncertainty settle in its place. Lydia walked beside him, her presence a quiet comfort. He could feel her eyes on him, watching him, as if waiting for him to say something, to explain. But there were no words that could make sense of what he had done. No explanation that could justify the turmoil inside him. "How do you feel?" Lydia asked softly, breaking the silence that had settled between them. Her voice was gentle, but there was an undertone of concern that made Elias's chest tighten. Elias paused, unsure how to answer. How could he explain the strange mix of relief and dread that was consuming him? How could he articulate the conflict that was still raging inside him, even after he had made his choice? "I don't know," he said, his voice low. I thought if I killed him, if I got my revenge, it would fix everything, that it would bring peace. But now that it's over, I feel empty." Lydia's expression softened, and she stepped closer to him. "Revenge never fixes anything, Elias. It just leaves you hollow, chasing something that will never fill you up. But you..." She stopped for a moment, her voice catching in her throat. "You made the right choice. You chose love over hate. That's the first step toward healing." Elias looked down at her, his gaze searching her face, as if trying to find the truth in her words. She believed in him. She truly did. But could he believe in himself? Could he believe that he had done the right thing? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a distant bell tolling. Midnight, the hour of darkness, the hour of monsters. But it wasn't just the toll of the bell that sent a shiver through Elias. It was the unmistakable feeling of being watched, a sensation he had grown all too familiar with in the years of his cursed existence. Lydia, sensing his unease, stopped walking and turned to him. "What's wrong?" Elias's eyes scanned the street, his senses heightened. There was no movement, no sound, just the quiet rhythm of the night. And yet, something felt off, a presence that shouldn't be there. "Someone's following us," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Lydia's eyes widened in alarm, and she instinctively reached for his hand. "Who?" Elias's jaw tightened. He could feel it now, an unmistakable energy, dark and familiar. It was Lucius. Even though Elias had chosen not to kill him, the vampire wasn't done yet. Lucius would never allow Elias to escape so easily. He would return, and with him, the wrath of everything Elias had turned his back on. "We need to move," Elias said urgently, pulling Lydia along as he quickened his pace. "Lucius isn't done with us. Not by a long shot." They ran through the narrow streets, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the empty night. Elias's mind raced, his thoughts clouded with the realization that his past was never truly going to let him go. Lucius would come for him again, and this time, there would be no turning back. As they turned a corner, Elias's eyes locked onto a shadowy figure standing at the end of the alley. Tall, gaunt, and familiar, the unmistakable silhouette of Lucius. His pale skin seemed to glow in the moonlight, his eyes glittering with cold fury. "You really thought you could escape me, Elias?" Lucius's voice rang out, smooth and venomous, as if no time had passed at all since their last encounter. "You think you've made the right choice, but you've only sealed your fate." Elias stopped in his tracks, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't want to fight. He didn't want to return to the endless cycle of violence and death. But Lucius wasn't going to let him go so easily. He had been wrong once before, and Elias wasn't going to make that mistake again. "Lucius," Elias said, his voice steady but cold. "I'm done with this. You're nothing to me anymore." Lucius let out a bitter laugh. You think you can walk away from me? You think you can just turn your back on the life I gave you? He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. You belong to me, Elias. You always will. Lydia stepped in front of Elias, her body tense with fear but her voice unwavering. He's not your slave anymore, Lucius, she said, her eyes blazing with a fierceness Elias had never seen before. And neither are you. You're nothing but a monster. Lucius's gaze flicked to Lydia, his eyes narrowing in disdain. The human girl thinks she knows what's best for you, he sneered. But she doesn't understand the power you hold, the power you've always had. You'll never be free of me. You can't escape your true nature. Elias's breath came in ragged gasps. The words were like poison in his ears. Lucius was trying to break him, to pull him back into the abyss. But Elias wasn't the same person he had been when they first met. He had changed. He had found something worth fighting for. You don't control me anymore, Elias said, his voice strong and defiant. I'm not the same man I was when you turned me, and I won't be the monster you want me to be. Lucius's eyes flashed with anger, but there was something else beneath it, fear. For the first time, Elias saw it, the realization that he no longer held the power over him. The silence stretched between them, thick with tension. Then, in a voice that was as cold as the grave, Lucius spoke. We'll see about that. With a flick of his wrist, he vanished into the darkness, leaving only the sound of his voice lingering in the air. The alley was still, the air heavy with the weight of Lucius's words. He had disappeared, as swiftly and quietly as he had come, leaving only an unsettling silence in his wake. But Elias could feel it. The presence of danger was thick in the air. Lucius wasn't done with them, and neither was the darkness that had shaped Elias's entire existence. Lydia's grip tightened on Elias's arm, her eyes wide with fear. He's going to come for us again, isn't he? She whispered, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to remain calm. Elias didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced around, his heightened senses searching for any sign of Lucius's return. But the streets were empty, eerily so. The town seemed abandoned, as if it too had been affected by the lingering shadow that Lucius cast. Yes, Elias finally said, his voice low and grim. He won't stop, not until he's completely destroyed me. Lydia's face hardened, a look of determination washing over her. We won't let that happen. We'll fight him together. Elias met her gaze, his expression softening ever so slightly. Her unwavering belief in him was both a gift and a burden. He wasn't the man he once was, but he wasn't the monster Lucius had tried to make him. And for the first time in centuries, Elias found himself fighting for something other than survival. He was fighting for her, for them. We need to move, Elias said, his tone more urgent now. We can't stay here. Lucius has too many resources, too many allies. If he finds us here, it'll be too late. Without waiting for a reply, Elias pulled Lydia along, guiding her through the dark streets toward a place he had hoped would offer some sanctuary. A forgotten estate on the outskirts of town. It had been his refuge once, a place where he had hidden away from the world. But now it felt more like a tomb than a safe haven. As they walked, the weight of the past seemed to press down on Elias. Each step felt heavier, each breath more labored as the shadows of his old life threatened to swallow him whole. He had turned away from vengeance, yes, but that didn't mean his past would let him go so easily. Lucius had been his creator, his master, his tormentor. And now, Lucius would stop at nothing to reclaim the control he had lost. Lydia seemed to sense Elias's turmoil, and she squeezed his hand, her fingers warm against his cool skin. Elias will get through this, together. Her words should have been comforting, but instead, they only deepened the unease in his heart. He had been alone for so long, trapped in the darkness of his own making. And now, Lydia had become his tether to the light. But what would happen when the darkness crookedly on their hinges. But to Elias, it was a place of memories, a place where he had once hidden from the world. They entered cautiously, the floor creaking beneath their feet as they moved through the musty hallways. Every corner seemed to whisper of the past, of who Elias had been before the curse had taken hold of him. "I thought I could outrun my past," Elias murmured, his voice barely audible. "But it's always there, waiting for me. Just when I think I've escaped, it finds a way back." Lydia stepped beside him, her presence a silent reminder that he wasn't truly alone. "You don't have to face it alone anymore," she said quietly, her words carrying the weight of something deeper. "We're in this together. No matter what happens, I won't leave you." For a brief moment, Elias allowed himself to believe her. To believe that the future wasn't just a series of battles and bloodshed. But as quickly as the thought came, it was swept away by the feeling of Lucius's lingering presence, the threat that still loomed just beyond their reach. The sound of a door slamming open echoed through the empty halls, followed by a voice, Lucius's voice, cold and mocking. "You think you can hide from me?" Lucius taunted. "You think you can escape your fate? You're nothing but a shadow, Elias. And shadows can't hide forever." Elias's hand instinctively went to the hilt of the weapon he had kept hidden for centuries. A silver dagger, its edge honed for the sole purpose of ending Lucius's reign. But even as his fingers brushed the familiar handle, a part of him hesitated. He wasn't the same man who had sought revenge all those years ago. Was this what he truly wanted? To kill again? Lydia's voice cut through his thoughts. "Elias, don't do this. You've changed. You don't need to become the monster again." He turned to her, his heart aching with the conflict inside him. "I don't know if I can stop it, Lydia," he whispered. "The darkness, it's inside me, and I don't know if I can control it when it comes for me." Lydia's eyes softened with understanding, her hand reaching up to touch his cheek. "You're stronger than you think, and you don't have to fight it alone." Elias's heart swelled with something more powerful than the thirst for revenge, something that felt like hope. He hadn't allowed himself to feel this in years. Could he truly walk away from the monster he had become? Could he choose a different path even now? Before he could answer, Lucius's laughter filled the room. "It's too late for you, Elias," he sneered, stepping into the room, his eyes gleaming with malice. "You think you can escape? I will always be a part of you, and I will make sure you never forget what you are." Elias took a deep breath, his grip on the dagger tightening. But this time, there was no hesitation. This time, it was not vengeance he sought. It was freedom, for him and for Lydia. "Not this time," Elias said, his voice firm, resolute. "This ends now." The room seemed to shrink with the weight of Lucius's presence. Elias could feel the dark energy radiating from the ancient vampire, the cruel reminder of everything he had once been. Lucius stood before him, tall and imposing, his eyes glowing with malicious intent. There was no sign of mercy in him, only the twisted delight of a predator cornering its prey. "You still don't get it, do you?" Lucius said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You can't escape your nature. You were made to be this, to destroy, to rule, to feed. It's in your blood, Elias. You'll never outrun what you are." Elias's fists clenched, the silver dagger cold against his skin. He had heard Lucius's words 1,000 times before, each one more venomous than the last. The vampire had always tried to break him, to remind him of the monster he had become. But now, as Elias stood there, his heart pounding in his chest, he realized that Lucius's words no longer had the power they once did. He had already made his choice. "I'm not what you made me," Elias said, his voice steady, cutting through the tension in the room. "I'm not your puppet anymore, Lucius. I'm free, and you'll never control me again." Lucius's face twisted in fury. His eyes burned with hatred and his lips curled into a sneer. "You think you're free? You think you've broken the chains? You're just a slave to your own weakness, Elias." You'll always come back to me begging for power, for revenge. It's who you are. Not anymore, Elias retorted, his gaze unwavering. You've already lost. With a sharp movement, Elias stepped forward, his silver dagger raised. His heart was calm now, his mind clear. This wasn't about vengeance. This wasn't about defeating Lucius to prove his strength. It was about breaking the chains that had held him captive for so long. Lucius's eyes widened with disbelief. You think you can kill me? He hissed. You think you can destroy what I've built? You'll fail. You always fail. But Elias didn't hesitate. With a swift motion, he lunged toward Lucius, his dagger aimed at the heart of the monster who had once been his creator. The blade gleamed in the dim light as it cut through the air, and for a moment, time seemed to slow. Lucius snarled, moving with the speed of a storm, but Elias was faster. With a twist of his wrist, the dagger found its mark. The vampire's body shuddered as the silver pierced his chest, and a guttural cry of pain echoed through the room. Lucius staggered back, clutching the wound with one hand, his face contorted with rage and disbelief. The wound was burning, the silver working its magic, slowly draining his life force. His eyes, once filled with arrogance and cruelty, now reflected something Elias had never thought he would see: fear. You fool! Lucius rasped, his voice weaker now, his strength fading. You can't kill me. I am eternal. Elias stepped closer, his heart colder than it had ever been. Not anymore, he said quietly, his eyes filled with the calm determination of someone who had walked through hell and come out on the other side. Your reign ends tonight. With one final push, Elias drove the dagger deeper into Lucius's chest, the silver working its magic until there was nothing left but a pile of dust and ash. The vampire who had tormented him for centuries was no more. The silence that followed was deafening. Elias stood over the pile of ash, the weight of his actions settling in. He hadn't killed Lucius because he wanted revenge. He had done it because it was the only way to truly free himself, to put an end to the past that had haunted him for so long. Lydia, who had remained silent throughout the confrontation, stepped forward, her expression a mixture of awe and relief. You did it, she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. You're free. Elias looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of exhaustion and something else, something tender. We're both free now, he said, his voice raw. It's over. But even as the weight of Lucius's death settled over him, Elias couldn't ignore the truth that still lingered. The battle had been won, but the war within him was far from over. Lucius had been the monster who had created him, but Elias had to face the darkness that still lived inside him. The rage, the thirst, it wasn't gone. Not yet. I'm not sure I'm the man you think I am, Elias said, his voice heavy with doubt. I've done terrible things, and I don't know if I can ever be free of the monster inside me. Lydia stepped closer, her hand reaching out to gently touch his arm. You're not defined by your past, Elias. You're defined by the choices you make now, and I believe in you. Elias looked at her, his heart swelling with something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in centuries: hope. I don't deserve your belief, he whispered. Yes, you do, she said firmly. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to keep trying, and I'll be here every step of the way. For the first time in a long time, Elias allowed himself to believe in something that wasn't vengeance or darkness or death. He believed in the possibility of a future with Lydia, a future that could be different from the life he had known. But that future was still uncertain. Lucius was gone, but the world they lived in was full of dangers. The darkness would always be there, lurking at the edges. Elias had chosen a new path, but the journey ahead would be long. There would be more battles to fight, more choices to make. But for the first time in centuries, Elias was ready. Ready to face whatever came next, not as a monster, but as a man. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, casting a pale, golden glow over the landscape. The town, once steeped in darkness, now looked peaceful in the early morning light, as if the night's turmoil had never happened. But Elias knew better. The night would always come again, and with it, the shadows would follow. He stood at the edge of the old estate, his back to Lydia as she quietly prepared supplies for their journey. The silver dagger, now stained with Lucius's blood, still hung by his side. It felt like an anchor, a reminder of the battle he had just fought and won, but it was also a weight, a burden that he wasn't sure how to carry. The past was dead, but the echoes of what he had been would always remain. Are you ready? Lydia's voice broke through his thoughts, soft but steady. She stood behind him, her eyes searching his face as if she could read every unspoken thought in his mind. Elias turned to face her, his eyes softening at the sight of her determination, her strength, the way she never once wavered in her belief that he could change. "I don't know," he admitted. "I'm not sure anyone can be ready for what's next. But we have to move forward. There's nothing left for us here." Lydia nodded, her expression serious, but there was a warmth in her eyes that made Elias's heart beat a little faster. "We can face whatever comes next. Together." Her words were simple, but they were everything to him. For the first time, Elias didn't feel the weight of his past pressing down on him. He didn't feel like a monster or someone doomed to fail. He felt human, alive, and that was enough. Elias reached for her hand, his fingers brushing hers, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. The only thing that mattered was the connection between them, the bond they had forged through everything they had faced together. The battles, the pain, the fear, it had all led them here. To this moment, to this new beginning. "We'll figure it out," he said softly, pulling her close. "We'll take it one step at a time." And so, they left the estate, walking side by side into an uncertain future. The road ahead would be difficult, there would be more challenges, more darkness to face. But Elias was no longer afraid. He wasn't sure where this journey would lead, but he was no longer walking it alone. And that made all the difference. As they walked through the streets, the town now waking from its slumber, Elias felt a flicker of something new, a spark of hope. He had been lost in the darkness for so long that he hadn't realized how much light was still left in the world. Lydia had shown him that, had helped him see the possibility of something beyond revenge, beyond the past. They reached the edge of town where the road began to wind through the forest that would lead them to the next part of their journey. The air was cool, the scent of pine and earth mixing with the faint promise of rain. Everything felt still and calm, as if the world was holding its breath. Lydia stopped walking, turning to face Elias. Her expression was one of quiet determination, but there was a vulnerability in her eyes that made Elias's chest tighten. "Elias," she said, her voice barely a whisper, what if we're not enough?" The question hung in the air, unspoken fears taking form. The weight of the future, the unknown that stretched out before them, was enough to make anyone question their path. And yet, Elias felt something inside him rise to meet her concern. Something strong and undeniable. "We are enough," he said firmly, his voice calm and short. "You and I, we've already faced the worst of it, and we've come out stronger. Together, we can handle whatever comes next." Lydia's lips curved into a small smile, a look of quiet gratitude in her eyes. "I believe in you, Elias. I always will." Elias didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached out and cupped her face in his hands, his thumb brushing the soft skin of her cheek. He had never imagined that he would find something like this, something so fragile yet so powerful. Something that made all the pain, all the darkness seem worth it. "I believe in you too," he whispered, his voice filled with a tenderness he hadn't allowed himself to feel in centuries. "And for the first time, I believe in myself." They stood there for a moment, the quiet of the world surrounding them. The road ahead was unknown, but with Lydia by his side, Elias felt like he could face it. He wasn't alone anymore, and that made all the difference. As they continued their journey, the sun rose higher in the sky, breaking through the clouds and casting a warm, golden light over the path before them. It was a new day, a new beginning, and for the first time in centuries, Elias could feel hope stirring in his heart, like the first rays of light after the darkest night. The road ahead was long and winding, cutting through the dense forest that stretched endlessly in every direction. The further they walked, the more the world around them seemed to blur into shadows, the towering trees casting dark silhouettes against the pale light of the sky. Elias could feel the weight of the unknown pressing against him, but it wasn't the threat of Lucius that kept him on edge. It was the deeper, more primal fear, the fear of what lay inside him, the fear of the monster he had been, and the one he might still become. Lydia, sensing his unease, kept close by his side. Her presence was a comfort, her quiet strength the anchor that kept him from slipping too far into the darkness. But even her calming presence couldn't chase away the storm that was building inside him. "Do you ever wonder if the darkness will follow us?" Elias asked quietly, his voice low and full of uncertainty. "Even after everything, what if I can't escape it?" Lydia's gaze was steady as she met his eyes. "The darkness doesn't define you, Elias. It's the choices you make that matter. And I believe in your choice to be better. You're not that man anymore. Elias didn't respond at first. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that the past could be left behind, that he could truly walk away from everything he had been. But every time he looked into the shadows, he saw traces of the monster he had been, of the rage, the thirst for blood, the pain that had consumed him for centuries. As they walked, the air grew heavier, thick with the scent of earth and decay. It was then that Elias heard it, the faint rustling of leaves behind them, the sound of footsteps that didn't belong to them. His instincts kicked in and he turned swiftly, his senses on high alert. "Lydia, stay close," Elias whispered, his voice sharp. She didn't need to be told twice. Her eyes widened in alarm, and she immediately stepped closer to him, her hand reaching for his. Elias felt the sudden chill that ran down his spine as the footsteps grew louder, closer. Someone or something was following them. The forest seemed to close in around them as Elias's eyes scanned the trees, every sound amplified in the tense silence. His hand instinctively went to the dagger at his side, his muscles coiled and ready for action. And then, from the darkness of the trees, they emerged, figures cloaked in shadows, their movements swift and deliberate. There were at least 6 of them, vampires, their eyes gleaming with hunger and malice. Elias's blood ran cold as he recognized their scent. One of them was no stranger. Lucius's followers, Elias muttered under his breath, his voice laced with anger. "They're still hunting me." Lydia's grip tightened on his arm, her eyes wide with fear. "How many more of them are out there?" Elias didn't answer immediately. His mind raced. Lucius was gone, but his influence lingered, like a shadow that refused to be erased. These vampires were likely remnants of Lucius's faction, and they weren't just hunting him. They were hunting Lydia too. "We need to get out of here," Elias said urgently, grabbing Lydia's hand. "We're not safe, not here." But before they could move, one of the vampires stepped forward, his face obscured by a hood, but his presence unmistakable. His eyes golden, glowing, fixed on Elias, his mouth curling into a cruel smile. "You're a fool, Elias," the vampire said, his voice deep and mocking. "You think you've escaped Lucius's grasp? You think you've earned freedom? You're just another pawn in a game you can never win." Elias stood his ground, the weight of the silver dagger heavy in his hand. "I've already defeated Lucius. Your master is gone, and I'm not your pawn." The vampire laughed, a cruel, hollow sound that sent a shiver down Elias's spine. "Lucius may be dead, but the cause lives on. You can't escape your fate, Elias. You're a part of something bigger than you can understand." Elias took a step forward, his body tense with anger. "I've walked away from that life. I've chosen something different." The vampire's grin widened. "You can't change what you are. You will always be one of us, and we'll make sure of it." With a sudden movement, the vampire lunged, and the others followed suit. Elias reacted instinctively, his body moving faster than he could think. He shoved Lydia behind him, his dagger raised as he prepared to defend them both. The first vampire came at him with blinding speed, but Elias was ready. With a swift strike, he drove the dagger into the vampire's chest, the silver causing the creature to howl in agony as it crumbled to dust before his eyes. But the victory was short-lived. More were coming, surrounding them, closing in with the intent to kill. Lydia, her face pale with fear, reached for the small dagger at her belt. Though it was no match for the vampires, it was a sign of her willingness to stand beside him, no matter the danger. Elias saw her resolve and felt a surge of determination rise within him. They would fight together. "I won't let them take you," Elias growled, turning to face the oncoming vampires. One of the vampires lunged at Lydia, but Elias was quicker. He grabbed the vampire by the arm, his strength surprising even him, and with a ferocious twist, He sent the creature crashing to the ground. He didn't pause to look, already turning to face the others. The battle raged on, the sounds of clashing metal and snarling vampires filling the air. Elias fought with everything he had, his body moving with fluid grace, his dagger striking with deadly precision. But the numbers were overwhelming. He couldn't fight them all. Then, as if the universe had answered his prayer, Lydia did something unexpected. With a swift movement, she threw the small dagger she had at one of the vampires, hitting him square in the chest. The silver worked quickly, and the vampire fell to the ground in a heap of dust. "Stay close," Elias shouted, his heart racing. "We need to get to cover." With the remaining vampires still pressing forward, Elias grabbed Lydia's hand, and together, they ran, leaving behind the fight for now, knowing that survival was their only priority. They ran through the forest, the sounds of pursuit echoing behind them. Every step Elias took, his heart pounded harder, the weight of their situation pressing down on him. His breath came in ragged gasps, but his senses were sharper than ever, the adrenaline keeping him focused. Lydia kept pace beside him, her hand tight around his. She was scared, that much was clear, but her determination burned as brightly as his own. Elias had always fought alone. He had never known what it was like to fight for someone else, to have someone who would stand by him no matter the cost. But now, with Lydia at his side, he felt something new, a sense of purpose, a reason to fight beyond vengeance, beyond survival. The vampires behind them were relentless. They had seen the power that Elias wielded, and they would not rest until they had him, body and soul. They weren't just hunting him. They were hunting the last remnants of Lucius's bloodline. Elias had once been Lucius's weapon, but now, the vampires saw him as a threat to everything they had built. Lydia's breath hitched as she stumbled slightly, but Elias caught her just in time, pulling her close. "Keep going," he urged, his voice rough. "We have to get to the river." The river was their last hope, a place Elias knew well. There was an old, forgotten path through the woods that led to the water's edge, where they could find cover. But it was miles away, and every second they spent running was a second closer to the vampires catching up to them. They pushed forward, the forest dark and oppressive, but the light from the moon filtering through the canopy above gave them some guidance. Elias's mind raced. What would they do once they reached the river? Could they outrun these vampires forever? How many more were out there? "We need to think of a plan," Lydia said between breaths, her voice steady even though the fear was evident in her eyes. "This can't go on forever. We need to finish it." Elias glanced at her, his heart heavy. "I don't know if we can. Lucius's followers, they'll keep coming." Lydia stopped running and turned to face him, her eyes fierce. "We can finish it. Together. We have to. You've already taken down Lucius. This is just the final step." Her words hit him like a surge of electricity. The last step. The final battle. The thought had been in his mind for weeks, but he had pushed it away. He hadn't wanted to think about it. But now, with Lydia's belief in him, Elias knew she was right. The final battle wouldn't just be against Lucius's followers. It would be against the monster inside him, the darkness that had kept him trapped for so long. He had to face it once and for all, or else he would never truly be free. "Lydia," Elias said, his voice low but determined. "When we reach the river, we need to stop running. We need to fight. I'll face the darkness and I'll end it. For good." Lydia's eyes softened and she reached out to cup his face in her hands. "You don't have to do it alone. I'm with you." Her touch, her words, they grounded him. And for the first time, Elias believed it. He didn't have to face the darkness alone. He had her. They had each other. Before Elias could respond, they heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps, fast, determined, closing in on them. They had no time left. "Stay close," Elias said quickly. He pulled her behind him as they reached a small clearing in the woods, the river just ahead, its murmur filling the air. "This is it." The sound of the vampires grew louder, but Elias didn't hesitate. He turned to Lydia, his eyes filled with a fire that had long been extinguished. "Get ready." Then, from the shadows, they appeared. At least 5 vampires, their eyes glowing with hunger, their bodies rippling with speed and strength. Elias's heart pounded in his chest as he gripped his dagger tighter. This wasn't just a fight to survive, it was the final stand. "Come and get me," Elias growled, his voice dripping with defiance. The leader of the group stepped forward, his golden eyes gleaming with malice. "You think you can defeat us, Elias?" the vampire sneered. "You can never escape. You will always be one of us." Elias's body tensed, the rage that had simmered for centuries bubbling to the surface. "I'm not one of you," he said, his voice steady, unwavering. "And this ends tonight." Without another word, the battle began. The first vampire lunged at him, claws bared, but Elias was faster. He sidestepped, driving the silver dagger deep into the creature's side, watching as it crumbled into dust. One down. The others were faster, more aggressive. They attacked from all sides, but Elias moved like a blur, his instincts honed by years of survival. He wasn't just fighting for his own life anymore, he was fighting for Lydia, for the life they could have together. Behind him, Lydia's voice rang out. "Elias, watch out!" Elias turned just in time to see one of the vampires approaching from behind, its fangs gleaming in the moonlight. He spun, knocking it to the ground, and with a swift motion, plunged the dagger into its chest. Another one fell, but the others were relentless. They surrounded him, their eyes glowing with rage. Lydia fought too, using the small dagger she had, but she wasn't as skilled as Elias. Still, she fought with everything she had, and Elias couldn't help but admire her strength. She was fearless. Together, they fought side by side, 2 warriors against the darkness that had followed them for so long. The battle was fierce, but Elias could feel the light inside him pushing back against the shadows. He was no longer the man who had been driven by vengeance. He was stronger now, more determined. And with Lydia at his side, Elias knew this would be the end of it. The battle was relentless, each strike a clash of wills, Elias against the darkness, the past against the future. The vampires fell one by one, their bodies crumbling into dust as the silver dagger sliced through the air with precision. But even as they were defeated, the darkness within Elias seemed to intensify, pulling at him like a gravity he couldn't escape. The shadows of his past loomed large, whispering in the corners of his mind. But this time he wasn't listening. Lydia fought with equal fervor, her movements sharp and swift, her courage a reflection of everything Elias had come to care about. She wasn't just fighting for her life or for survival, she was fighting for them, for the future they could build together. Her belief in him, in them, was something he never thought he would find. It had become his greatest strength. As the last vampire fell to the ground, a plume of ash marking their defeat, Elias stood there, breathless, the weight of the battle settling heavily on his shoulders. His body was bruised, his strength fading, but there was no fear, no dread. Only a profound sense of finality. Lydia came to his side, her face streaked with dirt, her eyes wide but full of life. She reached out and touched his arm, her touch gentle but steady. "Elias," she whispered, her voice full of awe and something else, relief, gratitude. "We did it." Elias looked at her, his chest swelling with emotion. He hadn't realized how much he needed to hear those words, how much he needed her. "We did," he said softly, a smile tugging at his lips for the first time in what felt like forever. For a moment, they simply stood together, the sounds of the forest around them the only noise. The river flowed quietly beside them, a reminder of the path they had walked to get here. Elias looked at Lydia, her face illuminated by the moonlight, and he realized something deep within himself. The darkness had tried to define him, tried to control him, but he was no longer bound to it. He had chosen his path, and for the first time, it was his own. The weight of the past, the years of torment, of bloodshed, of loss, didn't disappear, but it no longer held him in its grip. He had confronted the monster inside him, faced the darkness that had plagued him for centuries. And though the scars would remain, they no longer defined him. He was free. Lydia stepped closer, her hand slipping into his. "What now?" she asked, her voice soft, but full of hope. Elias looked out over the river, the water flowing steadily forward. "Now," he said, his voice steady, "we start over." The journey ahead would not be easy. There would still be shadows to face, challenges to overcome. But Elias knew one thing for certain, he wasn't facing them alone. He had Lydia. Together, they could rebuild not just their lives, but themselves. And as the first rays of dawn began to pierce the horizon, Elias felt something inside him stir, something lighter, something filled with the possibility of a future that wasn't defined by vengeance or blood. It was defined by the choices they made, the path they chose to walk together. They walked away from the forest, their steps light, their hearts filled with hope. And as the sun rose higher, Elias finally understood what it meant to be truly free, not just from the chains of his past, but from the darkness that had once consumed him. The future was unknown, but for the first time, Elias wasn't afraid. He had Lydia, and together they would face whatever came next.